Welcome everybody to an author conversation for our pre-recorded digital day here at Crossing the T's Festival. My name is Sherston Luckins, I'm Festival Coordinator, and I am joined by Iain, Rowan and Irenosen, Okojie. So the idea of today is that these delightful authors are kind of going to work in a duet. They're going to do some reading from their work and they're going to basically interview one another, which is going to be fascinating. They are both novelists and short story writers in different styles and genres. Iain Rowan is a novelist, short story author, placed second in the 2020 Costa Short Story Award, is a recipient of a Northern Writers Award, and has been shortlisted for the Bath Novel Award and the Crime Writers Association debut dagger for his work One of Us. He's also, I'm delighted to say, one of the judges for this year's short story competition. So he's been reading a lot of short stories recently. Irenosen has got a long string of accolades to her name. She was born in Nigeria and moved to England age 8. She's received a Betty Trask Award for her debut novel Butterfly Fish, and has released short story collections Speak Gigantula, which was shortlisted for the Edge Hill Short Story Prize and the Jalap Prize and the Saboteur Awards, and was nominated for a Shirley Jackson Award, and also Nudibranch, which has been longlisted for the Jalap Prize. She is the 2020 recipient of the AKO Kane Prize for her story Grace Jones, and received an MBE for services to literature in 2021. So been hell of a ride. Absolutely phenomenal list of awards and achievements. So it's incredibly exciting to have the two of you here speaking to one another and hopefully delving into all kinds of things about your writing practices and about the power of the short story and wherever you're going to take it. I do not know. So I'm going to hand over to these two beautiful people, and I believe they're going to start off with some readings to get a sense of one another's work, and then they're going to take it from there. So off with me, and pin Iain and pin Ire, and take me off all together and hide myself view. And I'm handing over to you guys now.
Lovely. Thank you, Sherston, for that wonderful introduction. Honestly, I'm so delighted to be here in conversation with Iain. I read your piece, actually, Iain, which it was so beautiful, emotionally charged, and just not a spare word out of place, just taught. And also, the beautiful exploration about fathers and sons, which I really, really enjoyed, that kind of familial closeness brought to the fore. So thank you so much for that. And I wondered if you could kick things off just by maybe reading an excerpt from either that piece or any piece you feel comfortable sharing.
I will do. Thank you, Irenosen. And then we're really interested in looking forward to hearing your piece as well, and talking a little bit more about that. And I think what's interesting and exciting for this conversation is we've got two very different stories that we've read of each other's, which opens up a whole set of discussions about the realist versus the magically realist and so on. But we'll come to some of that, I'm sure. So I'm going to read a little bit from my short story, Birds of the Mountain, which is the one that Irenosen's referring to, which was shortlisted and came second in the Costa in 2020. I'm going to be upfront about this. I've got a persistent cough that won't go away. Apologies to the listeners, viewers of this when it's released. So I'm just going to not try and hide it, but roll with it. So excuse me for it. Okay, this is Birds of the Mountain, or some of it. It was one small moment, but that's how everything like that always is. There was no reason for it to happen. The rock was dry and the wind was light, and they were almost off the ridge. The path dwindled into nothing, and there was no choice other than to climb up to where it restarted. The father knew that this was the hardest part, so he watched his son go up and stood below with his arms out ready. The boy scrambled onto the top of the rock, grinned and watched his father labour up until they both stood on the narrow, sloping platform, the world dropping away into dizzying air on either side. A bird rode the air above their heads, and the father wished he could identify it. The names of the birds of the mountain, the kind of thing that every father should know. Like the names of flowers and trees, he'd never quite got around to it. Worst bit over, the boy said, and he managed it. Not bad for an old man. The father rolled his eyes, but felt a stab of love that almost bent him in two. After all the years of a life twisted into the wrong shapes, it was hard to believe that this rangy boy man with a wide grin and a shock of straw-coloured hair was his. He remembered the moment the boy was born, blue and quiet and whipped away by midwives and nurses in calm panic. The father had stood like the subject of a time-lapse photo, everything a blur of motion around him while he was still and helpless. His wife said, "Where is he?" in a plaintive voice. He wondered sometimes if she remembered him standing there, doing nothing, and that had been the start of all the things that came later. "Come on then, Dad, let's do this thing. I'm starving." "Is there ever a time you don't think about food?" "We'll stop when we get off the ridge," the father thought. "Mini pork pies and individual cheeses and tea that tastes of the flask it comes from. Perfect." His son shrugged. When I'm asleep, though maybe not even then." He took a step on from the flat rock, and the father didn't even see what went wrong, but all of a sudden the boy had fallen and was sliding off the ridge to the left. The father dived, making a wild grab at empty air until fleece slid through his hand. He tightened his fingers just in time to grip his son's hand, but the momentum carried the father on, and he started to slide towards the drop himself. He flung his right hand out to the other side, scraping against raw rock as he slid, and then his fingers hit a jagged projection, an ancient horn reaching up to the clouds that weathered it. He grabbed it and held tight, and the two of them came to a stop, hung halfway between earth and sky. And that seems like a good place to leave it.
Thank you for that wonderful, devastating piece. I mean, it's got such power to it. I felt really emotional when I read it, actually. It just opened me up in ways that, you know, this is what great literature does, I think. It brings things to the surface that you don't expect. So yeah, it was really lovely to hear you read it, actually, because it adds another dimension to the piece when you hear it read out loud. Well, I'm going to read from my short story. I'm going to read an excerpt from Grace Jones, which is a piece that's featured in my collection, Nudibranch, a wild and fantastical collection about characters on the cusp of some sort of change. And in this story, Sidra, who's the main protagonist, is a Grace Jones impersonator navigating a past trauma in the present. So here's an excerpt. There was a building that remained a husk, a blackened charcoal carcass gutted from the inside out. The carcass leaned against the heavens in protest at its losses, at its snatched internal sky, tainted with the fingerprints of one last daily procession, rituals of the living. And while the world slept, awoke, the cities hummed with chaos and order, rivers began in cotton pockets, cupping slackened fists, the waters undulated into lost reflections, the gods got high off the colors from the seas, the equator adjusted itself only slightly, the stars twinkled in haphazard collusion, the mountains dappled by hamatan winds that became personal directions. The building remained, an artificial gut bathed in degrees of light, lodged in the stages of a day. The building was a hollow within a carcass, within a husk, within a world, within a galaxy, a series of crooked boxes varying in size inside each other, where the gift was always the same, always attached to a bottom that had gone missing. On each floor of the husk, Sidra was running backwards to the late afternoon of a day. It had been flat packed into cardboard boxes sealed with sellotape. On each floor, Sidra peeled off the sellotape, the sound, a split in the air whose line couldn't be traced. She removed items from the box. The late afternoon that day was made up of ingredients for cake: eggs, flour, butter, sugar, tinfoil, a whisk, vanilla. On each floor, Sidra ran to the window where she stood in costumes made of tinfoil. On floor 1, she was covered with eggs, screaming. On floor 2, she was drenched in flour, howling. On floor 3, she was soaked in butter, melting as a heat intensified while the whisk whirred ominously on the periphery. And so on. Grace Jones's La Vie en Rose played on a radio that wasn't plugged in anywhere. Instead, the plug sprang from the bottom of the building like an untethered electrical root. The husk shook. On each floor, Sidra grabbed the whisk. Lost scenes fell out from the windows. Water was inadequate. Hoses throbbed with adrenaline and burned hearts. Death traps, the lifts became stuck all over again, spewing firemen's costumes like overgrown fabricated insects. Like Genesis on speed, everything escalated quickly. Ashes assembled into figures crawling on the skyline before colliding with traffic, which destroyed them all over again. The equator turned a fraction. The flames rose. The bottoms of the crooked boxes were set alight. Debris became glowing cinders that walked. A dot appeared on the galaxy. The draftsman held a flame he angled like a stick of lead, like a tool that could change guise at any point. Okay, I'll stop there.
Beautiful, thank you. And it's really interesting, I think, the contrast, because Birds of the Mountain is by design, in part, I think, rugged and stark and weathered, and like you say, is quite sparse. The writing in Grace Jones is so rich, so full of color and vivid imagery, and there's so much going on in every line. So it's interesting to compare. And also, I have to say that right from the start, where you say that the protagonist is a Grace Jones impersonator, that had me hooked right at the beginning. It's like, oh wow, okay, this is going to be interesting. But it's a beautifully rich. I don't know if this is what you would call it yourself, so kind of do correct me if you think there's better. But for me, it's this kind of rich, magically realist story where the everyday and the fantastical blend. How do you see the magic in everyday life? How do you see the wonder that a story like this brings in, rather than just a realist tale of something which is happening in the world? Because in Grace Jones, something is happening in the world, but there is also a world around that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good question. And we're going to come back to your piece, because I definitely want to interrogate that more. Yeah, I mean, I think everybody has a unique perspective and a way of looking at the world. And for me, the magical in the everyday has always intrigued me. There is so much poetry around us, even while terrible things are happening. You know, a plastic bag billowing on a tree branch, somebody who's abandoned a pair of shoes at the park and you don't know who it belongs to. You know, you start to create a sense of what happened around that. So I'm just really intrigued by bringing the everyday and the fantastical together, but also what it allows me to do with language is really interesting, because I think it's writing that can't necessarily easily be defined, although obviously magical realism is a term that people understand, but I would say more speculative in a sense, because I think that that's broader. So yeah, I just love writing that sits in between genres in that way. And I'm somebody who's just, I have such a vivid imagination, and this is from being a child. I remember the first book I read was Roald Dahl's Fantastic Mr. Fox, and I loved that book so much. It was so fiendishly funny and dark and fantastical, but also, you know, it didn't underestimate young people. It gave young people a kind of dimension and richness, and which is something he did in all his work. So there was something, I think there was a seed planted there, but before that, you know, I grew up in Nigeria the first 8 years of my life, and oral storytelling is a big part of that, where you hear a story and every time you hear it, it's changed slightly by the next person who says it. So all of that had fantastical elements in it, you know, the process of listening to oral storytelling. So I think that is kind of, you know, those seeds were sown early, and it's kind of in my writing DNA to want to explore that and unpick that even more. So I kind of look at the world through that kind of lens, and I want to explore stories through that lens, because I find it really, really, really interesting. But equally, I find realist writing just as interesting. It just happens that my style is slightly different. You know, one of the first short story writers I loved was Raymond Carver, and the tightness of your work reminds me of that, you know, that kind of, I think it's such an amazing sleight of hand to be able to do what you've done in that piece, which is a piece that's so emotionally charged, but I think it traverses a gamut of emotions. So it's funny, it's warm, you know, you get the sense of this closeness between father and son. You get the proudness of the father, you know, there's just so much in it. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit about your intentions in writing the piece and how that came to fruition.
Yeah, and it just thinking a little bit about something you said there just before I get back onto my story, where you talked about like kind of the sleight of hand, and it's interesting because, you know, we talked about seeing the magic in the everyday, and it's almost like if you come at the world almost like with a pantheist or animist view, where everything is alive, everything has spirit, everything is haunted. You've got so much material because literally anything can become story. But it's interesting in writerly terms, because sleight of hand is what we do. It's how we do what, you know, whether it's a story like mine or a story like yours, it's this illusion, it's this trick that we pull off because it is just words on a page. And I guess what I was wanting to do with the story was explore the father-son relationship. There's a fair bit of my son in there, although a lot of the story doesn't reflect the rest of our lives in any way. The kind of wild, loving the outdoors that is my boy. And sometimes people say, "Oh, you know, where does your story come from? Where does a story like that come from?" And I'm kind of a bit like, I don't know. I thought about how awful it would be if you were caught in that situation that plays out in the story of what do you do when you're holding on to your beloved child with one hand, and with your other hand you're clinging on to the mountain that's the only thing from keeping you both falling. What would anybody do? And I think that just kind of came into my mind, and I wrote on from there. And I really like, in reading short stories, although I could admire a short story which is clever and well written, the ones I really love are the ones that make me feel emotional, that actually there's a bit of an oof when you read them at times, whatever emotion that might be. And I wanted to try and capture some of that, and not just make it a desperate tale of people in jeopardy, but actually put that warmth in that you talked about, that kind of human emotion, because otherwise I think it would have just felt like a gimmick. It would have felt like, yeah, okay, maybe exciting. Does the father rescue his son or does he not? But actually that wasn't really what I was interested in. I was interested in how the characters would respond. And I think in the same way in Grace Jones, it's that playing out of character and the uncovering of her trauma and the situations then that she then finds herself in that you know really drew me through the story. So yeah, I guess it was about exploring emotion and relationships was at the heart of what I wanted to do with it, and it came out over the course of a weekend. That story, almost not the finished thing, but the bones of it were born as a whole piece. And that's one of the things I love about writing short stories. You know, a novel is a big thing to encompass in your head, and sometimes it feels overwhelming. But I really like that with a short story, you can at least get a first draft down sometimes in a time that enables you to hold the tone, the voice, the feeling, the emotion in your palm of your hand while you're writing it.
Absolutely.
I mean, do you find a difference?
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on what you said, it's the same for me. I love both forms, both the novel form and the short story form, but I find the process of writing short stories really feverish. So I'm like you, I find them quite addictive in that, you know, you have the idea, you have a sense of what you want to capture on the page, and you just are absorbed in creating that world. And it's just a lovely feeling to be able to do it from start to finish, or whatever entry point. Sometimes you might start in the middle. I mean, this is the brilliant thing about the form, is that, you know, you can kind of play around with it and have fun, whilst also hopefully you know, capturing characters that feel real, that kind of reflect some sort of experience we recognize in the world. You know, for me, I was writing my first collection, sort of just making sense of what it's like being a, you know, a young Black woman living in the city, and how difficult that can be, and also how amazing that can be, and also how funny that can be. You know, so I just really wanted to capture that, because I hadn't really seen it done in a short story collection before, certainly not in the UK in that way. And I was also trying to make sense of a lot of traumatic stuff that was happening in the background. And it just felt like the short story was such a great vehicle for that, you know, because I had previously to that, I was working on a novel and I'd written a draft of it. But like you said, the novel is this big, intimidating thing. And I remember getting halfway through it thinking, oh my God, how am I going to get to the end of this? How am I going to actually pull all these threads together? You know, but there's something really powerful about the short form. I love the freedom it gives writers. I think it just allows you to be playful in a way perhaps that the novel doesn't. So yeah, I think everything you said really resonated with me. I was curious when you were speaking earlier about, you know, I'm always interested in how authors find their voice. And, you know, you asked me a little bit about, you know, my sense of the fantastical and why that's important. So I want to kind of flip that and pose that to you and ask about your authorial voice. You know, how did you develop that? You know, did you, like a lot of us in the beginning, read other writers and unwittingly you kind of produced the same thing? And at what point did you start to get a sense of, actually, what I have is something quite special and I want to continue to cultivate it and learn how to sharpen it?
It's a really interesting question to think about because we're an accumulation of all the things we've ever read and loved and seen and heard. And yeah, I think there was a certain amount of finding my way. And then after a while, after a few short stories that I'd published, I can remember somebody saying to me who was reading one before I sent it out, they said, "Oh, it's very you." I thought, "Oh, right, okay. I didn't know there was a me." And I've written across a lot of styles. Quite a lot of my work isn't realist fiction at short story level. I think one of the joys of writing short stories is you may be less boxed in than you are writing novels, in terms of the horrible questions that agents and publishers ask you about, well, what kind of novel is it? Where would it sit on the shelves? You know, to which you always just want to say from the bestseller bit, really, would be good. But, you know, going back to what we said earlier about, you know, speculative fiction versus magical realism versus that, you know, the phrase that came and went a little bit about slipstream because it didn't really fit in anything. And my novel writing tends to be crime fiction, but I always end up describing, well, it's kind of crime fiction-ish, and it's because it doesn't neatly fit a genre, and I do find that difficult. And I think at short story level, you can experiment and flex and change and spread your wings a little bit more, and yet maybe still find a way that a reader feels, actually, yeah, this collection fits together. There is, although these stories may differ, there's a recognizable voice or set of themes running through it. And I can recognize things in my writing. I tend to write a lot about identity. I tend to write quite a lot about characters who are slightly alienated or slightly lonely. there tends to be a kind of slightly melancholic, wintry feel to things. There's little touch points that keep coming back. Maybe that's because it's a reflection of things I like to read and like in others. And I'm endlessly fascinated by the process of creation, because a lot of my work just bubbles up at some point, an idea or a character, and then you sit and you work that and stretch it a little bit and play with it, and then something else happens and it turns into a story. It's rare that I kind of just have an idea about, okay, start, middle, end. That's what I'm going to write.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated by where this comes from, how we can chew on an idea for a while and forget about it, but it feels like in the background our subconscious is running with that, and that a month or two later it will just pop something else up into your conscious mind. Do you find that that it's almost like you?
I think with short stories, certainly in my case, even when I'm writing one, an idea for the next one is always bubbling. Once you get on that train, I think, of writing them, there's just something about the form that allows you to think about all sorts of things that you might want to interrogate. So it's funny because with the collections, it's not like certainly with the first collection, it's not like I had the idea of writing a whole collection in a cohesive manner. I was just, I read Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son, which is my favorite short story collection ever. It's just astonishing what he does with that small collection of interconnected stories. And I read that. Having not read short stories ever, I picked that up. I was just blown away. And it just lit a fire under me, because I always thought that, you could never be as invested in the short form in the same way you could with a novel. But reading his work proved to me that you could do, definitely. And so I wrote my first short story after reading that collection. And then I was just so excited. I kept going. I kept finding that, ideas would just bubble up, or, even when I took a break, after 3 or 4 stories, something else would come up. And it just felt like this excitement, I don't know, this feverishness, that it really suited the form itself. And also there's an end with short stories. Oh my God. It's not like a novel where you kind of lose momentum and then you have to figure out how you're going to get excited again about the project you're working on. I don't find that with short stories. I just find that I'm able to sustain the kind of forward momentum that comes from writing and being in that practice. So for me, I think it's really helped me as a novelist as well. I want to ask you about that, because after writing the first set of short stories, I had put the novel down because I was just fed up with it. I didn't know what to do with it. And then after writing the short stories, suddenly I felt less intimidated by the novel, in that I Jedi mind tricked myself into thinking of each chapter as a short story, as kind of interconnected, so in that way I was able to have a hold on the world. So I kind of wanted to ask you about that. How have you felt that the short form has helped you as a novelist as well?
I think that when you write short stories and then you're moving to a novel, or you're interspersing the two, I think it makes you value and work every scene more in the novel. That it's easy, I think, when you're writing a very long extended piece of work, to maybe just coast a little at times, because it's a bit of linking chapter that takes you from A to B. It's not the great set piece stuff or the exciting developments and transitions. And I think having that sense that comes from a short story is also, you want to make every scene sing. You want to make every scene give you that feel that a short story gives you as a writer. And I think I find it really interesting experimenting with different forms of writing. And I think they all inform and enhance each other. I've done a little bit of playwriting, script writing recently, and that's just given me a little bit more sense of space and the 3D-ness of a scene in a novel that maybe I didn't have before. That when I'm writing something, I'm thinking in that definite dimensional space of where the characters are, which sometimes I think you can lose when you're just focusing on character and they're against a flat backdrop. That really you place them in space. Poetry makes you think at the line level a lot, I think, about the quality of the words and the rhythm of your prose, which I think is really, really important. For me, when I read, plot is sort of down the list of things that make me love a book. Prose that sings, a voice, and I'm hooked, and I'll follow that wherever it goes. And I love, talking about Dennis Johnson, I love Emergency. It's one of my favorite short stories. And it's so funny because that and that collection are so Marmite that I've recommended them to people before, and people either love it and go, wow, this blew me away, this is brilliant, or what have I just read? What is going on here?
That's what we want them to think.
Yeah. And I like that very much, that in his stories, and in the same way in Grace Jones, he did this, that you don't have to explain everything. Some things can just be and be part of the story. And I don't like the idea that a short story is entirely a puzzle to be unlocked and you can understand everything in it. I love that feeling of coming away from reading something thinking, okay, I don't quite know what this bit was about, but actually it just worked in the context of the story. And
it's really interesting that you say that, actually, because that is something that very much resonates with me. I always go to the page not knowing fully, and I prefer that. For me, it's like a process of investigation, because I think if you know fully, what's the point? And David Lynch, one of my favorite directors, says it's like goldfish. You gotta leave room for things that you don't see coming from left field to come. So I kind of love that fluidity in the form, that you can allow yourself to do that. And like you said, sometimes you don't have a clue what's going on. Even me as the writer, sometimes I'm in a scene myself and I'm not sure why it's important to conjure the scene in the way that I've done, but I'm left with a really strong feeling that I want to capture. And I hope that the reader will get a sense of that. And hopefully by the end, yes, they'll have, some sense of things coming together, but also, like you said, they hopefully will have questions as well. That's what I think you want. You don't want everything to be neatly tied up. Yeah. You want to be left to process stuff. You want to be left to just be like, oh my God, what have I just read? Like with your piece, I was struck by the fact that the mountain, the landscape itself is like a character, and you just do that so well. And I was just like, oh my goodness, how has he done this? The force and the power of the landscape, it's like you can't escape it. You have this father and son in that perilous position. And they kind of have to contend with it, and they're forced to contend with it at an unbelievably quick pace. And it's like you said, it's what would you do in that situation? You have no time to think, you have no time to make sense of anything, and you're a father in the position of being responsible for your son's life in that moment. And I just found that it worked on so many levels. I was really, really struck by it. So yeah, that story is a gift. It really is. And it's a piece that I'll think about again, I think, and come to again, because like I said, just the power of it is really something.
Thank you. And thank you very much for what you said about the landscape. I think that's really important to me. And I do like reading stories where the landscape feels like a character in itself, but it plays that role. Birds of the Mountain, actually, for me, it wraps up, it ends in the way it ends, and it's fairly unambiguous, whereas I quite like writing ambiguity. So it's probably a rare exception. I've got a short story that I'm shopping around at the moment, which is, in very basic summary, it's about a mother whose daughter's gone missing, teenage daughter, and her daughter returns home. But won't say where she's been. So she's been missing for some time, police involved, months. She returns home, seems fine, won't say where she's been. And the mother suddenly starts to doubt that the girl in front of her is her daughter, even though in every way she resembles her daughter and knows all the things her daughter knows. The mother starts to think, you are not my daughter. And that ends very ambiguously. And some of my friends, I really enjoyed the ending, but one of my friends in particular who read it said, I hate you. What happens? And she said, well, but don't you, whether the daughter is the daughter or not? I said, no, I don't. I've got no idea. I haven't just chopped off the the truth. The story, the whole point of the story is about the ambiguity.
Absolutely.
And I think if you did that at novel length, the reader might feel a bit cheated. But again, it's something you can deliver through a short story, which is one of the virtues of the genre. You mentioned at the beginning in Kirsten's introduction about, you came to the UK when you were 8, and you came from a sort of Nigerian background with a rich history of oral storytelling. You have to forgive me, I've forgotten the name. Is it griots?
Griots, yeah.
Griots. Of these storytellers who something that used to be a thing in the UK, but it's pretty much died out now, of the oral story being passed down from storyteller to storyteller, and each time being embroidered and enriched and changed. Do you think that oral tradition shapes the way that you write and the way that you approach your writing, or your voice as a writer?
Thank you for that question. No, I definitely think it's a big part of my voice as a writer. I certainly try to honor that when I can. For example, with my debut novel, Butterfly Fish, part of the novel is set in the 18th century Kingdom of Benin, and it's a reimagining of Benin, and there's a lot of that kind of oral storytelling element, fantastical elements and changes within that section in particular. It was probably one of my favorite sections of the novel to write, and it kind of just wrote itself, really. But there was also a sense of reclaiming that legacy. I think that is really empowering as an author. When you have a history that you want to kind of interrogate and bring to the fore. I think at that point I was really quite fed up by Black history always being about slavery, and of course that happened, but there are other historical stories and things that happen that I feel are really, really powerful. So that kind of griotness, that the storytelling, the stories being passed down different generations, or not necessarily being documented, but finding a way to keep that legacy going on and to continue to enrich it was really important to me. It's something that I claim wholeheartedly. I love what it allows me to do, because you can kind of subvert it or find ways to subvert it and be playful with it, and that's something I think that's interesting as novelists and short story writers, is how do we find ways to stay excited about the form, whether it's incorporating legacy, or I don't know, a piece of family history that happened that might have been hidden for a long time, and suddenly you're able to bring it to the fore. These things are all interesting, aren't they, that you can kind of mine from. So that's something that I try to find ways to incorporate in the work, and to try and stay excited, but also by looking at different forms as well, not just personal history. But you mentioned playwriting, which I love, the theatre, especially fringe theatre. I remember going up to Edinburgh, and when I go up, I would just go for the fringe stuff, because you just don't know what kind of wild stuff you're going to see, and some of it's good, some of it's terrible, but some of it's good as well. So all of that stuff is I think it's really great fodder, really, for the writing. And I want to ask you the same thing. How do you find ways to stay curious about the form and to stay excited? Because I think once you officially become a writer, it changes from when you're a hobby, when it's a hobby, because now people expect a certain standard, and that can be difficult sometimes, to wear that hat. I don't think people understand how much joy it brings, but also how the costs of writing, it can cost you a lot. So how do you find ways to stay curious about it and excited, and things that make you want to return to the page?
Yeah, I think we're all really conscious, or most of us at least, really conscious as writers, that we're as good as the last story, and the next one is the challenge, and we're kind of, you always like looking to kind of keep that standard up. I think for me, returning to what I said earlier, in a way, it's about finding the thing in there that moves me. If I'm writing about something that moves me, that appeals to emotion, that excites me, or I want to get, if I can key into that emotional feel of the piece that I'm writing, then I'm away and I'm excited, and that feels different every time. And I think when I write, I start off with just a fragment of something, and I play with it and find a voice, a feel, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. I've got as every writer will have, I've got loads of unfinished things that start off and then lose their way a little bit, and it just didn't spark for me. And I think finding that spark is what keeps me fresh, or experimenting with genre or form, writing something different. I find it's kind of like the palate cleanser sometimes. You just have to move out of your ruts if you've got into one by doing something different, and the words will come. And I did a project, this is years ago now, where I committed publicly to, every week I'd put iTunes, as it was then, be Spotify now, I put it on shuffle, and whatever song came up, I had to write a short story inspired by it every week for a year. So that was the project I set out I would do, and it was called 52 Songs, 52 Stories. And that was great because it taught me that no matter what, sometimes I was ill, sometimes I was really busy with work, or the kids weren't well or whatever, but actually I wrote a story a week for a year. Not that long, but it was great because I was only writing for the purpose of the project. I wasn't writing them to particularly do anything else with them. So I found it incredibly liberating because I could just let go. And it's interesting reading some of them back, because the ones that flowed easily and the ones that I agonized over and really stuck this week, and try and tease that out, I'll finally can't tell the difference in the reading. And it's not necessarily that the ones that came easily were better. They just came. So I think I like keeping the notion of play in writing. It would be my short answer, having given a very long one.
It's a great answer, and play is the key word, I think. For me, you want to keep things fresh for yourself. You want to find ways to stay excited, otherwise, or find different entry points. So that project, writing to music, is great because it means that you're challenged in a completely different way each time. So I think it's about finding those ways of taking the idea elsewhere or doing something different with it, because otherwise, like you said, you just sit in a kind of rut. You mentioned poetry earlier. That for me, I think, has been really key. I love poetry. I love the freedom it allows you to play with language, and at a sentence level, what you can do with imagery, how you can bend a sentence. I think I was really influenced by poetry early on. When I was working on the novel, I would read a lot of a poet called June Jordan's work, because I just love not only the fact that she was, she wasn't just a political writer, but she was a great thinker. And her poetry was so expansive, she had different styles. It just blew me away. So, that showed me the possibilities of language. And I remember, at that time, which was a really important, critical time for me in shaping my voice, I would read a poem a day, almost like having an apple a day. It's a bit like listening to a song a day, and writing to it in that way. And something would just open up. And it felt like it opened up a part of my brain in a way that I just found really, really refreshing. So, I mean, this is the wonder, I think, of writing fiction and writing stories, is that all sorts of things can trigger that interest and that excitement, and it's, hey, maybe I'll look at paintings and write to them next. I mean, I certainly love going to exhibitions as well. I should say that's the other thing that keeps me really excited. If I ever find myself in a rut, I'll just go to an exhibition,
okay.
And just see stuff, because I find that also gives me ideas. I find myself coming up with responses to the images and to the paintings, and I just love that. I think, drawing from other art forms is also really important for us as writers, and like you said, also just moving through the world. You can't write if you're not out living. So I'm conscious of that as well. I don't think I could be a writer that would just be holed up writing all the time. I have to have things to write about. So for me, it's that balance of, yes, having, you know, the playful and the fantastical, but, you know, I'm also, if I'm honest, writing a lot about characters who are on the fringes, who are traumatized in some way, who are disenfranchised, who aren't visible and not often centered in stories. And for me, it's important to make them rich, multi-dimensional people in a way that honors their humanity, you know, but also make them complicated and messy, because that's what being human is like, and not being held to a particular standard. So it's this brew, you know, that you try to, you know, that you try to kind of get right, of being true to the character, but also capturing the world that they're in a way that makes sense, I think.
I like what you said about characters on the fringes. That really appeals to me very much. When I mentioned about writing crime fiction at novel length, I'm not interested in writing about. I don't do police procedurals. I'm not interested in writing from police perspective. They've got the cavalry on tap. They've got the power. They've got the law behind them. And I'm not particularly interested in writing from the criminal's perspective, because in the kind of inverse of that, they have the kind of power of violence behind them. So my stories tend to revolve around people who are caught in the cracks in between, very ordinary people who find themselves in a very difficult situation, but who tend to be marginal people living in the margins of society. That interests me a lot to write about. And I have a real touch point I read, and I have no idea who said this originally, but it was a photographer talking about photography, and they said that in terms of taking photographs, for them, the most interesting things happen in the margins, the moments between day and night, on a beach, the bits between sea and shore, the kind of liminal aspects of things. And that's always stayed with me as a almost as a touchstone for me about that. I like writing about characters who are caught between two worlds, who are on the edges and in danger of falling down the crack in between them. And the other quote that, again, I can't attribute properly, that steps back to your discussion about poetry and what it does for you. And I think certainly for me, the poetry I like does this, but also prose. I think it was Charlie Parker. So this is definitely a jazz musician, but I think it was Charlie Parker who said, it's not just about what notes you play, it's about the space in between them. And that has always really stuck with me. And that's, I love fiction or poetry or drama that just creates that space and lets you, the reader, come into it. And it's really hard to point to and say, this is how you do that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I love
really
that
hard.
you said that. I love that space in between, because there's so much to mine from that, and there's no one way of doing it as well. You know, each time you do it, it's different. that's the fascinating thing about it. You know, so, and also that you said your crime stuff doesn't neatly fit into the genre. To me, that makes it sound even more appealing, because once again, it's taking it elsewhere. You know, you don't want it to be exactly as people would expect a crime thriller to be, because we've had that, you know. So exactly. So it's just, you know, it's just pushing the boundaries and finding ways to do that, I think, is what makes us interesting writers. And actually, there's lots of crossover, even though we're stylistically very different. I think from this conversation, we have similar intentions in terms of you know, the sort of voices that we're interested in capturing, the sort of spaces we're interested in exploring, but the different ways that we do that, you know, and that's really, really wonderful. I'm conscious of time, so I want to ask you, what I mean. I'm very excited to hear about this story that you've told me about earlier, but I'm curious about what you're working on next. Are you working on a novel or another collection?
Well, I am very much working on, I'm working on the ideas and planning for another novel, because the one that is finished is due to go out on submission. My agent's taking it out anytime now, so waiting for London Book Fair to get out the way, and then it's going to go out, which is going to be the both exciting and nerve-wracking time. And I'm trying to work up some idea. I've got some ideas for a follow-up, but something that came up in conversation with the agent just gave me a bit of pause for thought, which is, excuse me, that it's possible a publisher, if they like the novel, might say, oh, there's scope in that for this character to reappear in the next one. Or they may not be interested in being a series character. It's not written to be, but actually the ending certainly makes that possible. So I feel I need to have some ideas on both sides, because if somebody comes back to me as a publisher and says, I really like this, but I would also be really interested if you were doing more of it, I want to be able to say, absolutely, yes, I can. And this is the idea. So I'm in that stage at the moment of batting around ideas, getting really excited about them for a while, and then thinking, this is the most stupid idea ever. And, you know,
Classic
you kind
author.
of lose face. Yeah. And then you go back to it a little while later, well, actually, it's not so bad.
Yeah.
But also for me, really importantly, is trying to find that thing that if I'm going to write a novel, it's a long old haul and a lot of work and a lot of hard times in the middle when you feel you've lost your way. And, you know, as you were describing, that point in when you just only get part way and think, wow, a lot to do. So the idea has got to be one that I'm going to be able to live with and work with, that excites me, that keeps me going through those dips in the writing. That's where I'm at now. What about you?
Yeah, no, that sounds really great, actually. And you want to be really invested in the novel, like you said, because you're going to be with this thing for the long haul. But it sounds to me like you are, you know, it sounds like there's ideas off the back of this one, which is, I think it's a great place to be. So I'm keeping fingers crossed, because that sounds potentially really exciting. I have just, with great relief, finished the first draft of my next novel.
Fantastic.
Yeah, but I'm in that dreaded place of like, oh gosh, I've got to send it to my editor now, and you know, what are they going to say? What's the feedback going to be? You know, because I've had to wrangle with this one quite a lot, just because, you know, I was quite ill during the pandemic, and you know, so there was a lot of stopping and starting, and that can be very disruptive, as you know, in the process of trying to get the momentum and, you know, really get that rhythm going while you're writing the project. So it's been difficult, but you know, it's also been lovely to work on it properly this year. So and somehow I've managed to finish a draft, which is, you know, I'm going to have a couple of gin and tonics, I'm telling you right now. So
is there anything you can tell us, a little teaser as to what the novel is, where it's going?
It's set in two different time spans, you know, so historical and modern. And it's also weird and fantastical once again. And it's about female desire as well, which is interesting to really explore, I think, in a bold way. So yeah, that's a bit of a tidbit.
Fantastic. Oh well, good luck with the editor's list of notes that you will inevitably get back.
I know.
We all
oh
go
God.
Through. Yeah.
I think congratulations and good luck are due to both of you. You've got projects on the go and plans for the future. And I have been listening in while you've been speaking, and I was popping my face up to say thank you so much. You've spoken for your full time and taken us to some really amazing places and insights and wonderful chats about the impact of other genres and how to keep the love of literature going as you slog through it, which is something that comes up for everybody. So I'm going to make us all even on the screen. There we go, the three of us on the screen. And I just want to really extend my heartfelt thanks to both of you for bringing such an amazing array of questions and answers and wisdom to our Zoom today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
It
was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking us. The time has flown by.
It's
been
really
brilliant.
has.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much. And yeah, I can't wait to pick up your book, Iain. I'm looking forward to doing
and likewise.
that. So, and likewise. Good luck. Good luck.
Yeah.